Hi, I'm Rob Dressel. I'm the director of cinematography for Layout.
I'm Adolph Lusinsky, the director of cinematography lighting on Raya and the Last Dragon.
And this is the Go Creative Show.
Hello and welcome to the Go Creative Show, a podcast for filmmakers. My name is Ben Consoli, and today we have Rob Dressel and Adolph Lusinsky, cinematographers for the Disney animated film Raya and the Last Dragon. Guys, welcome to the show. It's so nice to have, first of all, people from Raya and the Last Dragon, but also two guests. Usually we only have one, so we are lucky today. How are you guys doing?
Good. It's a pleasure to be here. It's awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. This is exciting.
Now, this is exciting for us because we very rarely get to talk to people about cinematography for animation, and there's so much to discuss. But before we get there, I just want to quickly mention our sponsor today, MZ Education for Creatives. And of course, follow us on your favorite podcast app, search Go Creative Show, hit subscribe, and you will never miss an episode. And Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, all of those places, search Go Creative Show, and you will find us, all things Go Creative Show, at gocreativeshow.com. So guys, what a great film. I mean, the cinematography, I guess is how I'll call it, because I'm not really sure even what else to refer to. But Raya and the Last Dragon is just visually stunning. And I can't even imagine what a fun project this must have been to work on. I mean, congratulations on such a successful, really nice looking piece. It's great.
Thanks. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you so much.
And what I want to start with is just understanding the role of cinematographers in animation. So, and I'd like to kind of even just understand what your titles are and how you're involved in the film. So let's start with you, Adolph. Like, what is your role on this film, and what does that mean? And we'll ask the same of you too, Rob. But let's start with Adolph.
Yeah. So my title is director of cinematography lighting, and Rob's kind of the other half. So we're working as a pair, and we come on early in the film. And, our role is to shoot the movie kind of analogous to live action, but we're doing this all virtual. So it's definitely different. But it's, at the end of the day, it's the same idea. And you get an image that's been composed and lit and trying to tell a story. We get together really early on, and we're often working with a production designer too. Because everything can kind of work in concert. So we're all kind of three tied at the hip from the beginning till the end.
Yeah. And Rob, is that common to have one cinematographer for lighting and one cinematographer for layout? Is that common for animation?
It's pretty much standard, as far as I know, in the animation industry. And I think a big part of that is traditionally in production, they tend to be very far apart. Layout comes in very early to stage everything and start developing the shots that come in from story. And in the past, lighting might not come in until much later, but Adolph and I have worked on several projects together, and over time, we've always tried to narrow that gap as much as possible. Part of that is, like you said, we meet during pre-production, a year before we start production, to really plan out how we want to shoot the film and all the things that are going to go into it, all the color, that we, again, having the production designer as kind of our third tripod of cinematography. But we try and incorporate as much lighting into the layout as we can, because we're, normally a DP on set has that all at his disposal, and we try and think of that as much as we can, even though technically in my world in layout, we're not seeing the ultimate beautiful lighting we're going to have, but we're at least know where we're headed. So, but that's pretty much traditional.
So where does it begin? Now, you've worked together on other projects. This project comes to the table around when? Like, when did you first start hearing rumblings of, Raya and the Last Dragon?
Oh, goodness. I'm not good at dates, but it's at least 2 years out is when we kind of roll on. So I guess maybe 6 months before that, hearing like, oh, they're doing a dragon movie? Oh, that's cool.
Okay.
I like dragons, that kind of thing. And Adolph and I will be like, which of the films that are coming down the pike, like which ones are, pique our interest, which this one certainly did. But yeah, we'll start about 2 years out from release.
Absolutely.
And about a year of pre-production. And early on, the story and what's happening is very in its infancy, and we know that it's probably going to change quite a bit. So we kind of get those first passes and steps as to what we think where we're headed, but we know that that's going to change. We try and keep it dynamic.
Yeah. And Adolph, when you first hear about the film, are you getting like a script, or do you get basic animations to start? Where does it begin for you?
For me or us, I would say, is about 2.5 years out, you start hearing kind of rumblings. And then often directors at the studio are pitching ideas that are, really just images with a kind of pitch and words to, here's what we want to do. And here's 10 images that represent the movie. And Raya certainly got us excited from that pitch. But then shortly after, we'll get a script. And like Rob said, I think one of the things that's unique about Disney and probably maybe animation studios in general is since we're all in the same building working together, a script at Disney and the story will keep iterating till often just months before we finish production. We take that script and we start thinking about what we want to do, but also keep
that really surprises me, because my impression of animation, having absolutely no experience with it at all, is that you kind of have to lock things in really early, because how are you able to change that? It just seems like impossible to change an animation for me. That seems really hard to do. But it sounds like, Adolph, you're telling me that there's quite a bit of room for, exploration and kind of changes and revisions along the way. I'm surprised to hear that.
Well, it's certainly not without cost, but I think part of the studio is that flexibility, and story is king at Disney. So over the years, we keep on trying to figure out strategies to stay flexible. And as like Rob mentioned, layout comes first, but what we'll do is try to get a dig scout of an environment, even though we haven't laid it out. We'll pick a few shots and we'll start lighting, and we'll kind of do this rough define approach for fine tuning the models, the lighting, and then the layout will lock in as well. But we're trying to iterate along the way. And if story shifts, then we usually haven't finished product, production in that sequence. But with that rough defined process, hopefully it's less we're throwing away than more.
Rob, help me understand what layout means in animation. I want to understand what it is that you're doing.
Oh, and this kind of goes to that question too about the ability to change. So we don't do our stories in order, so we'll get a different sequence. If a sequence has been boarded and everyone likes it and we think it's ready for production, it gets turned over to the layout department. And our job is to kind of take those boards and, at the minimalist, we're translating it into a 3D world, but essentially we're building all the shots and staging all the action and the story for the movie. So we'll do kind of a rough pass. And our world, we're on the computer. It's a virtual set with virtual cameras, with virtual lenses and rigs. So it's shot the same way. And we try and kind of do a pass at the boards, and then we'll kind of go off and do our own versions of shots and combining shots. And we try and give the directors and the editor as many versions and alts, kind of like live action, where you kind of want to, editors love the more footage, the better.
Sure.
We will iterate with that loop, us editorial and the directors, and try and get that sequence to tell the story as best we can. Clarity is always king with us as well. So we want to, and also want it to be cool and appealing, but as long as the story is the number one goal. But what's great about that is, like you said, you don't want to reanimate a bunch of things, but in layout, because we work in this, again, we're in 3D, but it kind of looks more like a video game. It's all in the graphics card, and we don't render anything, so it's very quick turnaround. If there's a story change, like inevitably, there's always a sequence that we do. Like in Raya, it was the scene in the kitchen between Benja and Raya. And other parts of the story will change, and it's just enough that sequence will have to get updated, be it just dialogue, but sometimes an entire concept will have to change. So we'll go back in. Hopefully it hasn't been through animation yet, and we can just redo it or rework it in layout effectively, cost effectively, and not, if you have to reanimate something, or God forbid you have to relight something, you're further down into the pipe where there's a lot more artists spending a lot more time. So we try and work everything out during the layout process.
So the layout is basically the environments. It's also camera placement. Am I right?
Yes. So it's
what? Can you sort of like give us a bullet list of what layout includes?
Sorry, I'm going to think. Yeah, it's basically we do location scouts for all the sets that are coming in to make sure they're going to work. We're going to be able to shoot in there, and we do any kind of loops with environments to get those correct or working for the shots. We place all the cameras. We stage all the action, all the characters. We do limited animation. We don't do like lip sync or anything, but we do try and do facial poses, and we're trying to sell the scene as much as possible to know that it's going to work. We use lighting. Hopefully we can get lighting ideas from Adolph and the lighting department and incorporate that into as well. And we're basically, we're shooting and editing a film on the fly as we go.
That is so wild to me. It's almost like a really, really overboard animatic. That's
Exactly.
kind of like how I'm envisioning it. So that's interesting. So the state that you're involved in let me ask, are you involved in the project all the way through to the end? Or do you sort of create these scenes, camera placements get locked, performances get locked, and then it goes for like that final animation?
No, we actually stay with it the whole way. So while it's in animation, we have what we call a camera polisher, and he works directly with the animators because, the performance that we do in layout may not be at all what the animators thinking. They kind of bring their expertise in and bring things to life. So if they kind of rework something or change something, we have a cameraman with them at all times to help kind of rework the shot live with them as they go. When it's out of animation, it comes back to layout and what we call layout finaling. That's to get all the cameras perfect and reacting properly. We put all those subtle moves in the camera. If a character just moves his head a little bit, we're going to adjust our cameras and give it that live feel, that operated feel. So when it leaves us, we also have to get the sets. That's the other part of layout finaling, is make sure the sets are in order. But we're basically preparing it for lighting for Adolph. And then while it's in lighting, as we go, I'm in lighting dailies all the time just to make sure that the cameras are still working, camera shake, depth of field, all the things that Adolph and I planned in the beginning. We still stay together till the very end to make sure it's all working.
So Adolph, talk to me about when you now jump onto this project. I know you're involved from the beginning, but when you start doing the lighting work, Rob and his team have worked on the layout. They're getting it in a good place. Locations are set. Cameras are set. When do you then now come in, and what is your first, order of business?
Yeah, I mean, as the projects have gone on and Rob and I have worked together on more movies and the technology's gotten better, we try to jump in. Often we're clawing at layout, like give us something.
Camera set.
So often while they're in a layout iterating process, we'll have some kind of master shots that help establish a sequence that we're often working on, especially for the first half of the production. As things go faster and faster, and we kind of got a better sense of where this film was going, we're working on other sequences, so we can't be quite that tied. But for quite a while, we're trying to get stuff on. So we're on top of Rob and layout, and we're doing this iteration process, and then they're changing something. We're like, oh, we thought we had established that, but we keep iterating as we go along the way.
So as lighting cinematographer, though, can you do something similar that Rob did and just give us almost like a bullet list of what you're responsible for?
Sure. Yeah. So, the first thing we're responsible for is coming up with ideas to what we want this movie to be at a really high level. And like Rob said, what he was kind of alluding to is we really break down the story and how we're going to tie the cinematography to different story thematics, to character arcs and things like that. So when Rob is mentioning following through and we're kind of tied together at the end, we're kind of reminding each other of let's not lose the vision of that. And then what we start doing in lighting is we're really establishing what we get is kind of a blank slate. there's textures that have been applied to the sets, but it's if we were to render it, it would just be a black image. So we literally start lighting these shots, and usually we'll start with some establishing shots, and then as we go and get the shots, we're relighting for those shots, depending on what the story is. It could be more about really relighting characters to sell that story moment or that emotion. If it's about establishing this world, we'll put a lot of the effort there and relighting those shot to shot. And then our iterative process is what we call is we have a DigScout step in which we might grab stuff and light it at that part. And then we do what we call foundation lighting, where we're really trying to light the overall sequence once we get the overall layout from Rob and see what that looks like. And then once we get a buy-off from the directors, that looks really cool. And the way we've lit it and the values and the colors, the atmospherics that we might place to help sell the mood and the value structures in the image, we'll go on to shot lighting.
Now, do either of you have experience in live action traditional cinematography and lighting?
Not shooting on set. The closest I was doing a lot of previous work on live action films, but never actually behind a physical camera.
And what about you, Adolph? Any live action lighting?
No. I definitely definitely did visual effects for quite a while, but I actually come from a painting illustration background. That's what I went to school for, which really actually is fairly applicable because we start with such a blank slate in animation and nothing's kind of for free. So having some kind of vision to what that's going to be has been really helpful, or to just roughen ideas as well.
I'm curious because it seems like probably more on the camera side of things than the lighting. Well, maybe not. It seems like there is a certain level of traditional cinematography, traditional lighting you have to be familiar with in order to sell an animation, especially now that animations are so lifelike. I mean, decades ago when it was just hand-drawn, old school animations, it didn't feel like lighting was as big of a deal or camera movement was as big of a deal. Now you're basically it's a movie that just happens to be animated. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Let's take a quick moment and talk about MZ Education for Creatives. Now, you want to think about MZ as kind of like the Netflix for creative education. And what I mean by that is you go on MZ and you have access to hundreds of hours of courses that are high-quality, video-based filmmaking education and all sorts of things. Topics like directing, cinematography, post-production, visual storytelling, and more. And isn't that exactly what we need to be better at, right? This is what we do. This is our craft. And MZ can help you hone your craft and perhaps learn a new skill that you didn't even know that you had or you didn't even know that you loved. Could open doors for you. Who knows? But the best thing to do is head over to gocreativeshow.com/MZ and check it out for yourself. But let's be honest, education is only as good as the teacher, right? And that's what MZ really makes, that's really what makes MZ different from everywhere else. You have top quality trainers that are working in the industry. They're actually working in the industry and at a high level. The Art and Technique of Film Editing is a new course by Tom Cross, and Tom Cross is the editor of La La Land and Whiplash. So, I mean, that's the kind of caliber we're talking about. Vincent Laforet is a trainer on there. Shane Hurlbut, Philip Bloom, the Ari Academy is there, and so much more. Now, yes, you can buy individual courses, and that's great. But what I suggest is you become an MZ Pro member. That's how you get that Netflix-style membership that I was talking about. And you can get 20% off of any of your purchases there by going to gocreativeshow.com/MZ and using GCS20 in the promo code, GCS20 at checkout. And you will get 20% off of your purchase. And the purchase I suggest is an MZ Pro membership because that's what I do. I love it, and I know you guys will too. So check it out for yourself at MZ, gocreativeshow.com/MZED, Education for Creatives. what is the skill set that one needs to have in order to be in the cinematography world in animation? And I'll start with you, Rob, on the layout side. What skills does somebody have to get into that?
Our crew, the foundational thing we like is people that want to be storytellers, because ultimately that's what we're trying to do. But we look for people that do have a background in film, cinematography. We get people in animation, a lot of people from live action. A lot of our artists or some of the supervisors like me actually come from live action. So we kind of teach each other a strong composition aesthetic, and then even knowing editing, like how shots go together and why. Because that's a big part of the storytelling too. It's not just, I got a bunch of cool shots, but how do the shots go together and do they communicate properly? But yeah, the way we shoot everything is as though, and I kind of learned this when I was doing more previs work, but we try and make our cameras all feel like real cameras. Like, in animation, you can kind of do whatever you want, but we want it to look like you said, like a live action film that happens to be animated, because that's what our audience is used to seeing, that kind of camera language. Like we use dollies and orbits and push-ins or cranes to get our shots. The new thing now that drone shots are becoming very popular in live action and television. So that kind of opens things up a little bit. We can, instead of the big helicopter shot, we can kind of do a little more crazy camera work, and it's not going to take an audience member out of the movie because they've seen that before. They're starting to get used to that. But we always try and stay as grounded, even down to where the f-stops that we use. If we're lighting a very bright scene, there's going to be a certain amount of depth of field we're going to get versus a very dark scene. And we can cheat that as we need to, but we try and keep in the realm of what real cameras are doing.
We had the director of photography for the Lion King live action-ish one that came out a year or so ago. Mm-hmm. And that discussion was about how they basically shot it with cameras. Like it was digital. It was animated, but they were shooting with camera rigs, with traditional camera movement and all that. Mm-hmm. Were any of those tricks employed in Raya, or was it purely just computer-based?
We've dabbled a little bit with kind of virtual cinema with like a motion capture camera for a handheld feel. Yeah, but we've never. Was on the set to see them do the work on Lion King. It was amazing, but it truly was engineered for artists that were used to actually literally pushing dollies and moving cranes. It was all physically generated because that was their muscle memory, their skill. Whereas our skill, we can do dolly moves and all that, but it's all virtual. All that, what feels like a handheld or a hand operated, is all done digitally. That's the talent that we have in our camera people, is that ability to virtually make it look like that.
That's amazing. Now, a couple minutes ago, you were talking about the ability to kind of cheat things to get the proper f-stop and the proper, exposure and depth of field. But another thing you can cheat is lighting. I mean, Adolph, I'd love to know from you, how are you kind of employing these traditional lighting techniques, but also with the conveniences of controlled environments and being able to move the sun where you want, move things where you want. Let's start with the techniques. Similar to what I had asked Rob, what are some of the skill sets that people need to have in order to be a lighting cinematographer in animation?
Yeah, just like Rob had mentioned, some kind of understanding of story, and being able to sell emotion with what they're doing with the lighting. And then after that, I think it's kind of two components to it, because we are Disney and we do try to produce beautiful images beyond probably what you could shoot on a camera. And so the artists do have an eye for color and subtleties at a really fine level, as well as being able to build really clean value structures to frame and compose for the story we're telling, light over dark or dark over light and things like that. And then I think the third part is then really thinking about, or maybe there's one more part after this, but thinking about this as a moving picture. So what are we doing with the light as we're moving? Is it flashing to try to tell a story? Do we re-expose as the camera moves and things such as that. One thing to keep in mind about animation, and Rob kind of alluded to as well, is the things you kind of see in live action, like lens flares and booms on the lens, and exposure changes. Those things are all kind of artificially done on top of this, and so the good thing about that is we have artistic control over those things, where you might be struggling with that, or where you can't get a light quite up there, and we can just hide a wall in the CG world. The downside of it is you really have to study that stuff and really watch films to try to replicate those kind of things.
Yeah, I can imagine it would be pretty easy to have it look unnatural because you have so much control to do anything you want. Like, okay, a lot of times we talk to cinematographers and they're saying like, all right, the light is motivated. There's a big window. We have a large giant light source outside the window. And then basically we're just kind of bouncing or just adding a little bit of fill to a face. Are you using similar techniques in animation where you kind of have like your one established light source and then filling in with maybe practicals or bounces and things like that?
I think theoretically, we often think like that there's some kind of motivation for the light. Like you said, there's a window, like I'm being lit. But ultimately, I think that's for the viewer to feel that. But ultimately, just like you had mentioned, we're putting a lot of fills. We're putting a little bit of a rim to pop a head out, or we're going to put a little extra light on the environment to separate the character, or we're going to darken it so they melt away in it, depending on what that story is. So it's the motivated light, I think, is interesting, and trying to sell like this animation world is very believable. But then I think really, a good chunk of the work then is really creating a beautiful image that gets as much as emotion as possible. And one thing I would say is we do try to do it as with few lights as possible and try to keep it clean as possible. And the reason for that is, we have to propagate those light rigs to many shots. And the cleaner it is, the better it works across a lot of different camera angles.
Now, you had a unique challenge, both of you, in Raya and the Last Dragon, because you needed to create 5 different unique looks for each of the 5 tribes. This just sounds incredibly daunting to me. And each one is different. Each one feels, they feel real in a way. They feel authentic in a way, even though they're clearly like, fantasy. But you bring a lot of authenticity to these worlds. And I'd love to talk to you about kind of your approach to creating all of these. We've got fang, heart, spine, talon, and tail. There's so much going on there. So talk to me first about kind of your reaction when you knew this was what you were going to do. Is this a fun, exciting challenge for you? Or is it like, oh man, how are we going to do this? And then talk to me about the way you got it done. And Rob, we'll start with you.
It was definitely a challenge in the beginning, to think, we've done movies before with multiple lands, and that just opens things up. When we first started planning our cinematography, we were actually talking about very specifically shooting and lighting based on the lands. But we found that trying to stick with that too much was too much of a departure from the story. And we kind of planned our cinematography more about the through line of Raya's journey with trust. So we realized that the environment wasn't that able to key on, but at the same time, it's all about
that snoring
design.
Is hilarious, by the way. I have to interrupt you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is it really that bad?
I can hear it. I think it's really funny, but okay. I want to make sure the audience understands what it is. So you're just going to hear a snoring dog. It's fine. Just get over it. You've all heard it. You've all been home for a year. You know what a snoring dog sounds like. But I don't think we need to disturb the dog at all. Who doesn't want to relax on a nice day like this? So fine.
There was one thing we did do as far as how we were shooting, because of the story, like in Tail. Well, actually, the lighting is a little more geared towards that. I'll just stick with camera for a moment. Like for Fang, anything we did in Fang, we kind of wanted to shoot that everything with a centered composition. We tend to not shoot things very centered. We tend to keep things more closer to the thirds, and For Namari and her world, we kind of wanted the set to be symmetrical and her world to be symmetrical. Our production designer for environments, Helen Chen, was really pushing for that. Like, somewhere in this movie, I would love to do something centered. So we chose Fang as that because it was its own thing. They're the enemy, if you will, of the film. So we kind of set them a little bit apart with how we shot them. But lighting wise, I think that's where you really see the difference amongst the environments.
I'm just hearing
Me too. It's so funny.
It's great. It doesn't.
Now I think he's easing into his REM sleep, and we're really starting to hear it now. Yeah, Adolph, talk to me about your standpoint of this, because, like I said, you're creating 5 worlds. They need to be different. They need to be authentic. They need to follow the story and support the story. It's a big challenge. How are you doing that with lighting?
Yeah, it's interesting. Rob had mentioned we've worked on a handful of projects together, and one thing that in our process that we've developed over projects is actually not getting too connected to the lands, because what happens inevitably in the story process is the emotional arc or thematic that ends up happening in a particular location can change. And that really flips things, at least as far as lighting and how you shoot it as well. So our approach was really looking we were thinking about the lands, but then we were really thinking about, we had 2 story thematics, which was trust and distrust. And what we did is we start talking about what cinematography attributes do we want to go with that. So, for example, with trust, it was a much more soft lighting, much more long lenses, shallower depth of field. Really, we'd worked with a set designer to place things that would get bright hits of light or light sources to get really nice bokeh effects. So the production designer, like Rob had mentioned, we were working really closely with to try to do this, but we were really looking at story thematics. And then once we really understood where those were going to land in each land, we tried to incorporate what was going along in that land to kind of support the story thematic. So, for example, water is tied to trust and everybody coming together. Once that happens, the drones take over, the water goes away. So, like Tells was all about the distrust story thematic. And so things start working out like that. So it was very dry and arid. And then, we had already knew we were going to shoot that story thematic very with high contrast. We have virtual film stocks. We wanted to use a really contrasty film stock and LUT on that particular thing. And Rob, you could talk about the lens choices for our distrust story thematic.
Yeah, we in that same way we have our trust and distrust, so we kind of want to create a contrast. We have one style that's a certain way, and then we kind of pick the opposite to contrast those. So, like Adolph was saying, in trust we have long lenses which give us that compressed feel, pull a lot of that bokeh. Higher cameras, more eye level with our characters. And then, when we flip that for the distrust, we want that sort of that wide lens, which makes things a little more uncomfortable. It opens up everything and everything gets into sharp focus almost painfully. And we can do that either from one sequence. We think of it more sequence to sequence as opposed to land to land. But to Adolph's point, the opening of the film is in Tail, which is all about distrust because it's Raya trying to get her start in the film. And we're starting where we pick her up after all this horrible stuff has happened. But even in a certain scene, we'll actually go from shot to shot, back and forth between a long lens and a wide lens, depending on what character we're looking at. If we're looking at Sisu, who is the epitome of trust, we shoot her on a very long lens. We get sparkling water behind her. When we flip the camera, we shoot Raya. We're on a wide lens. Everything's behind her is in focus, not very attractive. And the wide lens kind of makes it unattractive too. And we're actually trying to get the audience to feel that contrast between these very two different themes that are battling in the film.
An example of that in the film is the midpoint of the story, where Ryan and Sisu are having a conversation. So if you watch that, there's these really sharp, spiny spikes behind Raya and behind Sisu. We've
Mm-hmm.
placed water that sparkles when it's shot with a really shallow lens.
Yeah, and you feel that too as a viewer. Like you definitely, when something is comforting and trusting, and when something feels wrong, and like there's bad vibes in there. There's trouble looming. You can really feel that. Exactly, you can really feel that. Did you have any visual references for these lands? Like were you looking at films, photographs? What was inspiring you as you were developing these lands?
Yeah, we definitely were looking at a lot of other films. A lot of ones that were shot more naturalistic, so like Revenant or something like that. But then also films like Indiana Jones were really inspiring. They really captured the feel of how we wanted to light this movie, where it felt motivated, but at the same time it was stylized and really added to the adventure. And it's worth saying, I don't know if we've said it before, but we had a really talented production designer, Paul Felix, who was exploring the color script and painting that for production, to really have something to kind of visually see what this is going to look like. There's a much quicker way to explore overall ideas with the directors with little thumbnail paintings. So he was doing that. He's super talented.
Rob, any references for you as you were doing your layout? What was inspiring you?
We were talking about like that sort of balanced or symmetric compositions. Movies like Hero just have that sort of reverence feel to the characters and a lot of close-up work. Some anime, like for action, anime movies like Kill Bill, just that have a lot of movement and dolly work for the fights, a little more lyrical in their way they capture the fights, as opposed to just brute force, but then also just handheld madness, like the Alien movies, just that kind of camera chasing somebody down a hallway where you lose them a little bit. So yeah, those are kind of all over the place.
I want to talk about Sisu, because you had mentioned a few minutes ago that character is kind of like the epitome of trust. And I want to talk about kind of the way that you created the lighting and the look around this dragon, Sisu. Let's start with you, Adolph. Like, how did you approach this character, knowing that it kind of represented trust?
Yeah. So we knew Sisu fell under that story thematic of trust, and very early on we had talked about Sisu would be everything we talked about: shallow lenses, bokeh, things like that would be associated with trust, the softer lighting, and Sisu would be that amplified. So some of the shallowest shots with the most prettiest bokeh, the softest lighting was with Sisu. And then she had another aspect too, which is she had a power in which she could glow as well. So we had our lighting soups and lighters exploring that aspect as well, in a way she could illuminate the room, and also really provided that height of all the broad color range and saturation at the end of the movie as Sisu comes back to life with all the dragons.
And Rob, for the cinematography, what were some of the things that you were doing to amplify that concept of trust?
Always try and shoot her on the longer lenses, which also helped because she has sort of that snout and the big eyes. So we always want her to look amazing. And the longer lenses just do that much nicer. So we'd always keep her away from anything that was too wide. Even at the worst moment, we'd still avoid that. I think the widest lens was when spoiler, but when she passes. But a big thing with a character like her is more in the staging of her, is keeping her with Raya, but she's got this much bigger head than Raya. And she's got different heights. Sometimes she can have her head right down with Raya, and sometimes she stands up on two legs, and there's a huge height difference where she can actually carry Raya. But that's more the challenge for us, is just to kind of keep them always together in the scene with appeal, without feeling one is very different than the other.
Yeah.
But it was surprising. It didn't turn out to be a very hard thing. It kind of just fell into place, but it's a much bigger character, especially if you're on a boat. You have to put this large creature with the humans. So wrapping her around things and finding little places for her to hang out in just the right way is also a challenge.
I can imagine. In our last few minutes, I want to talk about the most challenging scene for you. And it may be the exact same scene for both of you, but let's start with you, Adolph. What was the most challenging scene in Raya and the Last Dragon? Why? And then how did you overcome that challenge?
I think it was, I don't know if it would be scene, but it was that third act because the whole
movie, the whole damn thing was hard.
Because it tends, it's an important part of the story, so it comes a little later, and it's always the most complex, where we have the most effects, and we're establishing different types of magical things. So, for example, but it's really fun at the same time. But for example, when Raya and Amari finally have their showdown, a lot of that atmospheric that really made that world feel like the world was crumbling, and all that smoke. The lighters were placing that shot to shot to really give that world the feel it needed. And effects had provided us with an amazing library to do that. And then that went right into the world where it crushes in, and all of a sudden they're kind of stuck underground with all these drones. And that we started that maybe a month and a half before the end of production. And it was one of the most complex and longest sequences in the movie.
Wow.
So it was very much a challenge to what are this drone going to look like? How do we get really nice value structures so we can read what's going on down there? And as well, creating that chaos and placing different types of effects that really felt like the world was an absolute chaos at that moment.
And Rob, same question for you. The most challenging scene, why, and how you overcame it?
I'll actually go to the same one that Adolph was talking to about the final battle between Raya and Amari. We knew we had multiple fights in the movie, and this had to be the biggest and craziest one, like the most emotional. So I really wanted to kind of take some cues from anime to really kind of push things a little bit. And one of my artists, Chris McCain, is a big anime fanatic. He does CG anime at work just in his downtime. So kind of set him loose on that and just let's go crazy. Just come up with as many wild ideas as you can, and we'll just throw it at the editor and work from there. And luckily we had actually, to get the fight moves, we had a choreographer on the show, and we were able to even do some mocap to pick up a lot of the fight choreography. So he had a lot to work with. He had a lot to clean it up, but we had this really big fight, and the camera was kind of crazy and all over the place. And the directors were like, "This doesn't feel like an animated film. It feels like a live action movie, but I like it." It's like, okay, we're going down the right path. But eventually we had this great fight, but it was really long. So the editors and directors, we all had to kind of get it down to something that still worked in the film, and then reworking the ending to really play up the emotion of Raya kind of really battling hard against Amari and finally disarming her. But I'll also mention the scene that Adolph is talking about with the drone. The drone were this kind of amorphous, blob. And early on in the production, we only had sort of basically just kind of a big blob that we moved around. And then animation would then kind of work a little bit, but effects really had to kind of figure that out later. But for that scene, the last scene, effects was able to generate sort of a big pixely version of the actual drone, because the composition, that last sequence, we have to feel like there's no escape and there's nothing but drone everywhere. So we always wanted them in the frame, but then it all had to kind of slow down so we could let the emotional beats take place in the sequence as well. So the wind kind of slowed down and the drone all kind of slowed down so we could get all that stuff in there, but still feel like they're in dire situations. So that finding that balance to work, and it's the pivotal moment emotionally of the film, but it's also the most deadly moment. So that was crazy. That was a tough sequence.
I just can't even imagine. Like I'm so impressed by the talent that both of you have and the teams that you're working with to get these animated movies out. Like, it just seems impossible to me when I see it. I'm watching it, I'm like, how do you do this? It just seems insane that this can even be done and at such a high level. But you certainly did it. I mean, the film is fantastic. It's called Raya and the Last Dragon. It's available now, basically everywhere you want to have it. It's a Disney Plus. You can see it in theaters. You can get a Blu-ray, I think is probably out now by the time this episode airs. Go see this movie. You will be better for it, and you'll be happy that you did. And if nothing else, just to watch the spectacular cinematography and how you really created what feels like a live action in animation. You really did. It was just so incredible. So thank you so much, Rob and Adolph, for your time. And we'll have to have you back for when this new project comes out.
That would be great.
Thanks, man.
Awesome. Thanks so much, man.
All right. I want to thank Rob Dressel and Adolph Lusinsky for coming on the show and talking about their cinematography work on Raya and the Last Dragon. I am always so fascinated with how cinematography is incorporated into animation. It's just like mind-blowing. I don't get it. And every time I have these guys on, I'm just like, wow, how do you do it? But I'm fascinated. So what are you going to do? And I'd love to hear your comments on this episode as well. So please let us know in the comments. I also want to thank Connor Crosby from ignitionvisuals.com for producing this podcast here and making it so great. And Dave Siegel from siegelsound.com for mixing and mastering the podcast and making it sound so good. So thank you, Connor and Dave, for making it all happen. I also want to encourage you to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. And of course, your favorite podcast app. Search Go Creative Show. Hit subscribe and you will never miss an episode. And for those of you that want to hear more of me, I don't know why you would want that, but some people out there do. And if you do, you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter. Search Ben Consoli, and you will find me and see all the things I'm working on with my production company, BC Media Productions. All things Go Creative Show at gocreativeshow.com. And I want to thank you for joining us today. And we'll see you on another episode of Go Creative Show next week. Go Creative Show, a podcast for filmmakers.